A couple of podcasts ago, I was talking about in the American landscapes, the Main Street landscape, the huge impact of the automobile. When the automobile suddenly brings the idea of personal individual mobility to the landscape, especially here in the United States, how that just completely changed the relationship that people had with the land, had with their neighbors. It's about everything. Here in Hawaii, it's different, but the impacts look the same. And in fact, you could argue now they are becoming the same. But at least initially, the impacts were somewhat different. And part of that is just because you have to remember a lot of the property in the Hawaiian Islands. Let's just zoom out here. Sorry. A lot of the property in the Hawaiian Islands is vertical. It's very steeply sloped. And here's we're zoomed in on Wilhelmina Rise here. Wilhelmina Rise is a good example. St. Louis Heights, our campus itself is a good example. You have to remember that prior to, basically 1910, if you were going to build a house on a hill here in Hawaii, you had to move everything up there pretty much entirely by horse and wagon. And if you visualize St. Louis Heights or even moving up campus, you're not going to get a horse and a wagon up there. You might be able to get the horse and the wagon up there, but not if they're carrying anything, maybe like 10 bricks or something like that. Basically, your hillsides weren't usable. You could plant crops on them, but you couldn't really use them for residences, or people really couldn't access them because they pretty much had to do it on foot. Horses don't like going up steep slopes, and cattle and other animals zigzag across them. They don't go up a hill. They go basically wiggle their way forth up and down it. So it's a very long, very strenuous process, and it's actually quite dangerous most of the time. And so hillsides here in the Hawaiian Islands were not really used much at all, right into the early 20th century. When the automobile becomes the new form of transportation, then this has enormous consequences here in the Hawaiian Islands, especially here on Oahu, most spectacularly, because in the period prior to the automobile, everyone who was somebody pretty much lived here. They lived in the area of Nuuanu Punch Bowl. And the reason was if you had, if you were wealthy, that meant that you could get to your office or your working area down here in Bishop Street in downtown Honolulu very, very quickly. It would take you maybe a half an hour because remember, horses only go about 2 or 3 miles an hour. Now, they're 1 horsepower machines. And so, in that context, the wealthy lived near to downtown because they're the ones that pretty much ran everything. And that's where you did that was downtown. Now, when the automobile shows up, several things happen almost immediately. One is the wealthy no longer have to live downtown. So the wealthy now are going to move out of the downtown area to areas that are cooler. For example, in the Hawaiian Islands, once you move in the ridges, not only is the climate better, it's not as here near as sticky as Nuuanu gets, but even on the ridge up here, it's a much nicer environment. It's got a great view. There's all sorts of things that you can take advantage of. Now that ridge was there, but there was no one living on it prior to the automobile because no one could get up there and it was too much of a hassle. If you lived up on this ridge and you tried to get into work every day, I would think it would probably take you about an hour and a half to make that short distance just because of the difficulty of going up that very, very steep slope and then back down. So when the automobile shows up, you can, as with the mainland, you can pretty much not only be mindless of distance, which of course really isn't here much of an issue in an island, but you can be mindless about elevation. So all of a sudden, what you can get is being wealthy started to translate itself into either being further out, which would be like Black Point and Kahala, or more importantly, it would be being on rises versus being in valleys. So the valleys very quickly become areas where if you have a lot of money, you're not going to live because being in the valley means that it's going to be more sticky. It's not going to have a great view. It's not going to have a lot of the advantages that being on a ridge or a slope would. Because if you're on a slope, and here's a good example, you got Palolo here, and here you've got the ridge. It's probably, what's 5 to 6 degrees cooler on average. You've got a nice breeze all the time down here in Palolo. Good luck on that. You've got a great view. Most of these places do. And one of the ways you can sort of see this, if you look at how congested and how compacted and how small these houses are versus how nice and big and fancy and large these houses are. That gives you an idea of what happens is very quickly the folks that had been wealthy who lived near town pretty much are the first to jump on the bandwagon moving on to ridges or other places further away, giving themselves more property. And then this allows them to do basically a Hawaii version of the mainland attitude of socioeconomic segregation. So whereas in the mainland, you segregate yourself more by, maybe a little bit of a ridge, but just simply by having a neighborhood where only wealthy people do, Beverly Hills, for example. Here in Hawaii, what happens is you segregate yourself by putting yourself on ridges, and then the poorer folks are in the valleys. So you've got Kapalama Rise, for example, or Kapalama Ridge has nice houses on it. Kalihi, not so much. Palolo, small houses. Wilhelmina Rise, big houses. And so what you get is elevation becomes, and still is, one of the major discriminators in terms of value. You've got Aina Haina, which is fairly wealthy, but compared to Hawaii Lower Ridge, it's not even on the chart. And so what happens is being wealthy, you can see here, you've got your compacted population here in the valley. You've got your much wealthier population with some huge houses here up on the ridge. So what you get is your ridges, and still a huge part of local real estate today is what you do with ridges. And this is entirely the automobile. Now you do get some folks, Kaiser most famously, who basically comes up with the Hawaii version of the mainland subdivision, with the idea that you can be further away and still get to work in an hour. Well, back in the day, so you basically take fish ponds and you turn that into Hawaii Kai, which is the first of the sort of extent subdivisions, then sort of Makakilo on the other side. And of course, the problem with this is it only works as long as you've got relatively limited numbers of cars. As long as there's only a few cars, then everyone can still get to work in a hurry on Kalani Aniole. The minute you've got a gazillion people out there, then everyone's basically in a giant parking lot, and then this ceases to function as a subdivision. Um, but here, most importantly, when you think of Kulio O and you think of Hawaii Lower Ridge, your ridges become and elevation becomes your main definer of wealth and power, versus living in a neighborhood that maybe sort of gated, restricted, smaller area neighborhood. And Hawaii Lower Ridge and many of the ridges are partially gated neighborhoods. One of the few places in the Hawaiian Islands you have those. So what you get is here. One of the main functions of the automobile is basically to define wealth and status and property just by virtue of elevation. One of the other ways you see this, and let's zoom in very quickly here, would be and again, one of the stats that's sort of surreal about the Hawaiian Islands. Let's see if we pop in a street here. I have no idea where we are at. Is that we have one of the highest, I think it's still technically the highest rate of cars per square meter of pavement in the United States. And we have one of the highest rates of number of cars per licensed owners, which is really bizarre because we live on an island. And what you see right up here, I've just randomly picked a spot near where I live, is you see one of the side effects is you've got, especially in the neighborhoods with older homes like say Kapahulu, you got people, and many folks here have basically one-car garages, but almost invariably households own two or maybe three or four automobiles, which means all the rest of those things are going to be on the street. So unlike the mainland where you've generally got space, you can have two or three car garages. It's, except for rural areas, that's almost unfathomable here. And so what happens is you end up what you might call on-street parking. Now, one of the fascinating things about human behavior that really doesn't get a lot of study or much as it should is that you can have someone who has to suffer with on-street parking and all the consequences of that, especially if they're, in some area where, like say down here, where you've just got a bunch of folks parked. So you really basically are very congested, and you're actually using an area that would otherwise be lawn or functional green area now becomes basically just an extension of parking area. And one of the side effects of this then is that you would assume that at some point people would tend to restrict the number of automobiles they have, or go to other forms of transportation, motorcycles, mopeds, whatever, that would limit the amount of congestion they're putting on here. Because these cars not only sit here, but of course they all end up on the highway or the freeway at the same time and then congest those. We have one of the highest rates of gridlock again in the United States in terms of major road congestion. And it's bizarre when you consider this island is only about 30 by 50 miles and you've got almost 1 million people on it. And yet we've got, I believe, 1.6 or 1.7 million automobiles, which is an insane number. Because you have to remember the entire population here includes people who are too old or too young to drive. And of course, then you include rental vehicles, etc. You've got this enormous glut of automobiles. But the reason for that, very simply, is everyone who has these things feels like they have to have a car. They need that mobility. In some cases, they have to have two or three cars per driver. They need different things, different cars for different things, or whatever. Automobiles have become one of the major forms of consumption status in the United States. So if you go back to Williamsburg, back into colonial Calvinist times, your main status presentation was almost entirely your residence. That was pretty much your definer of everything. In the modern context, you could argue, for example, the folks that live here, the house might be part of their status, but in many ways, the automobiles are probably an equally important part of status. And in some ways, maybe more important because this is portable. In this case, if you're driving this thing around, you're driving your status around with you. So you can go shopping in Costco, you can go to Walmart, you can go to Alameda Center or wherever. And when you drive around in this automobile, you're making a statement of what I'm worth and what my perception of worth is. People don't have to drive by your house. So one of the huge things of the automobile that showed up very, very quickly, but is now absolutely dominant, is the fact that they're a hugely important form of identity and status and prestige in the United States. And this is one reason why on Oahu, people will not get rid of their cars. There's been tons of efforts to get people to reduce the number of automobiles, and none of it does anything. I mean, right now with the huge price of gas, it's having no impact on the number of cars. It's not like people are getting rid of their cars because they can't afford to put gas in them. They just complain and put gas in them because the cars are too important. Are they actually that functional? No. Are they a perceived necessity? Oh yeah. But it says something really interesting about the American view of the automobile, which I should point out is peculiarly American. You don't see Europeans having the same attitude, and you sure as hell don't see it in places like Asia, Japan, and Hong Kong, which I'm most familiar with. Automobiles, except in rural areas, are still considered a luxury. Huge proportion of the population in places like Kyoto, Osaka, Tokyo don't have don't have a car. In Hong Kong, very few people own automobiles. They might own a motorcycle. Most folks have mopeds, but they not only don't have a car, they don't feel like they need a car. And especially in a very compressed environment, because you have to remember our environment here, especially on Oahu, is very more similar to what you're going to find in most of Asia versus what you'd say if you're in, say, like Duluth, Minnesota, or something like that, where it's very spread out, or Boise, Idaho, where in many ways you actually need a car in much of the United States just to get around because things are so far apart. That's not really true here on Oahu. So, the automobile, especially here, the Hawaiian landscape and the automobile is real interesting because if you look at this little spot, I'm not sure why it's blurred out. Just go this way. If we just look at this here, if you just realize how much space here is actually car space, especially given the huge price, this is Kaimo Key, so incredible price of property here. You've got this big, driveway here. You've got a driveway here. To all extent purposes, all this area along the side is actually also a driveway because it's a parking lot. None of this is really landscape. None of it's actually part of the house. You can sort of see this because people very consciously are actually putting their house barriers here. And so what you've got is if you look at this area, you've got this enormous piece of landscape just in this one spot in Kaimo Key that basically is entirely dominated by the car and the things that relate to the car. On an island where landscape is incredibly expensive and housing is incredibly expensive, you've got this huge chunk of the landscape given over to transportation, which main function is probably more to do with status and prestige and the perceived need of freedom rather than the reality or promise that the automobile gave in the early part of the 20th century was the ability to get places when you need to. Most people don't need to drive the way they drive, especially here on Oahu. They do it because they can. And that's become addictive, but it's not a necessity per se. By the latter part of the 20th century, what you find is two sort of key themes really become key or central. One is the dominance of the automobile. The classic example here in this part of the island would be, of course, the development of H1, H2, H3, especially H1, H2, where you literally take neighborhoods like Kaimo Key and you really just push this corridor of car-related stuff right through and destroy entire neighborhoods for the purpose of providing transit for cars. And of course, then it becomes a necessity. And so you end up with this paradox that once you give area to cars and once you give area to people to use cars almost mindlessly, then that's a constantly increasing demand. As the population increases, that almost exponentially increases the number of cars, which exponentially increases the pressure to provide areas to put those cars. You got to park those cars. Those cars have to go somewhere. And all of this just sort of spirals, to a certain extent, out of control. Now, the other thing that's occurring in roughly the same period is that more and more by the 1960s, as you find that as transportation increases, especially when you get jet travel, more and more Hawaii becomes integrated into the mainland, especially the western part of the United States, as very much almost like a suburb of the western, of California, basically. And so what you find is more and more investment comes from the mainland. So more and more you find that businesses here, for example, find themselves purchased by a mainland chain. More and more you find mainland, big box retailers in the last 40 years that move into Hawaii and basically, take away market share from local businesses. There's very few actual local businesses left anymore. Grocery stores are a classic example. And so what you find is if I'm McDonald's, I'm going to build my stores in Hawaii exactly the way I build them on the mainland if I can. Occasionally, like the Haleiwa one, you'll be told you can't. You have to make it, more appropriate to the community. But these mainland chains that's kicking and screaming that they do that. To them, each store should look like they should be basically branded and symbolically related to all the other McDonald's so that people know what they are. And so what you get is the more and more you have mainland chains come in, the more and more this place looks like every other place in the mainland United States. And it should because they're the same businesses doing the same thing, offering the same product, to a certain extent, the same consumer. And so what happens is a lot of the local landscape starts to disappear by the 1960s, 70s, and 80s as we become more and more part integrated into the mainland, not only culturally and socially, but probably even more importantly in terms of the built environment. Places like Target and Walmart are perfect cases in point as much as, the classic sort of, fast food restaurant chains. And so what happens is the only complexity that sort of shifts this a little bit is that unlike much of the mainland, what you have is by the 1980s is you have significant investment from other areas, specifically Japan, in the 1980s, early 1990s, and the last, roughly decade, more and more investment coming from China, and then more later South Korea, and then again Japan again, which tends to sort of muddy the waters a little bit. But if you look at someplace like Waikiki, it's really interesting if you're actually to look at how many of the places there, if you don't count local owners, but they actually have some sort of ambiance that is local versus, very much mainland. Cheesecake Factory is a classic, international chain. Um, the store in Waikiki is no different than other stores. California Pizza Kitchen in Kahala Mall is part again of an international chain. And so what happens is more and more you find that mainland marketing, mainland consumption, mainland attitudes become basically reinforced in the landscape. And the built environment tends to, pretty much signify that similarity or actually sort of almost, merging into that same pattern. And so what you find is your built environment here tends to have very little that actually makes it distinctively different from the mainland, especially today in the 21st century, as this has become a sort of ever more quickly moving pattern. And so what happens along with this is that changes in tourism that occur, especially in the 1990s, in many ways would seem to counteract this. Tourism up until the 1990s was what we call sort of bulk classic tourism. People came over here on jets. They took a Roberts bus down to Waikiki, stayed at the Hilton Hawaiian, went and saw Don Ho or some other show in Waikiki, got on a bus and went home. By the 1990s, people are getting tired of that. They've done that. They want to experience new things. And the big buzzword of tourism since the 1990s has been the concept of authenticity. So if you're a tourist coming to Hawaii in the 21st century, you want an authentic Hawaiian experience. Now, don't ask me to explain what that means because even the tourists don't know. But if you don't provide that, you're not going to be successful. So what that means is if you're doing any sort of tourism-based design, your built environment, your cultural landscapes have to somehow try to attract tourism stereotypes of authenticity, not the authenticity of actual life in Hawaii, which might be like living in Kapahulu, but tourism stereotypes of what they think is stereotypic Hawaiian authenticity. And this becomes a hugely important thing because this is the new form of tourism in the last 40 years, has been the shift entirely to authenticity. And entirely is gone. I mean, Roberts doesn't exist except as basically a state supported truck bus company for schools. And so what's happened is the traditional system. There are no shows in Waikiki, as far as I know. The hotels have turned into owner share residences. So the whole world of tourism in the late 20th century is gone. It's been replaced by an authenticity driven, experience, that then if people feel like they have that authenticity, they'll then actually purchase a place here and live here part time. This becomes like the Hilani or the Disney Aulani Resort and places like that, which are basically the entire all of Waikiki now. Is that there's almost no hotels left in Waikiki. Almost everyone there is a part-time resident. Um, they rent it out to tourists when they're not using it, but someone actually owns those units. It's not owned by a company anymore. It's owned by an individual. And so this has a massive change because now you have this huge proportion of the population, especially in places like Waikiki, that live here part of the year that actually have invested in some cases millions of dollars for a condo or a piece of property that they're only in there for part of the year, and they purchased that because of their concern about wanting to be in an authentic experience, which is their idea of Hawaii, the authentic Hawaii. And so what you get is on one hand you get the built environment becoming more like the mainland. The symbolism, everything here becomes much more mainland. At the same time, the people from the mainland and, to a certain extent from Asia that are purchasing a lot of the properties here, and especially part-time residents, are purchasing them because they don't want it to be like the mainland. They want it to be authentically Hawaii. And if you ever get involved in commercial or especially tourism-based interior design, this is why that's such a nightmare target to go after because it's very undefined. It's very much in the eye of the beholder. And if you succeed, then become successful and very famous. If you fail, you sometimes might not even know why you failed. It's very much like grabbing smoke, and this is very much the Hawaiian landscape of the 21st century. Because more and more we're like the mainland. There's very little here that is actually different anymore. It doesn't mean the population's the same, but the way we look and much of the built environment is literally just taken lock, stock, and barrel from much of the mainland United States.